everyone, and good morning. Very happy to see a lot of familiar faces and also some people I haven't met yet. So this is, I would say, the second webinar that we organized to focus on two specific core vocabularies. So today we'll tackle the core location and the public organization vocabulary. The whole idea is to present the different issues which were tracked by everyone as a group and to discuss together how we plan to resolve them. And at the end of the meeting, if we have sufficient time, we'll also close the pending issues which were discussed during the previous webinar on the core person and business vocabulary. But so without any further ado, I'll hand over the floor to my colleague Pavlina, who has been leading, I'd say, the technical work. Thank you very much, Pavlina, and voila, the floor is yours.
Good morning to all. Thank you for attending our webinar. I would like also to thank my colleague Seth for his kind introduction. I would like to sincerely follow the well-known webinar practicalities. Mute your microphone. So we would like to have your consent in order to record the webinars, and please share your question in the Q&A session via the chat. As my colleague said mentioned, next slide please. We are having next slide. We are focusing in today's webinar in the two vocabularies: core location and core public organization. As a general, under our general action of revising core vocabularies. During our previous webinar, we tackled significant part of issues related to core person and core business, and in the previous webinar we also presented a new version for core criterion and core evidence. Next slide. So I want to present you once again core vocabularies. I think that you're really aware of them. The focus here is on location and try to be aligned with the new releases of Inspire and all the updates, and to tackle issues that are related to core organization that were presented were expressed via the GitHub issues. Next slide. The reason for this is, as we mentioned, that the previous major revisions were made a long time ago, and the objective is this year to propose a harmonized and updated version of all core vocabularies and the SEMIC solutions. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, the review process, we started the review process. Excuse me? We started the process of revision the 13th for the core vocabularies, the 23rd of April. We will try to tackle the two remaining vocabularies today, but we are in case where there is a need to tackle the remaining issues involving all vocabularies. We will plan a new webinar in the months to come. So we will. The intention, of course, is to have a new release end of May, if this is feasible, and it is it is approved by the working group. Next slide, please. So I give the floor to my colleague Dimi Shepherd to present you the changes that we are proposing for those two vocabularies. Thank you.
Let me just jump in here. Max Dekkers here. I'm the moderator today, so I'm going to hand over to Dimi for discussing the proposed changes to the core vocabularies. What we're doing is we're going to present the changes that were made based on comments that were provided. We also will cover some open issues where we have some questions also to the group here. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. And then by the end of this first part of where we will be looking at the core location, I will then repeat the question from the chat and possibly give the person who asked the question the floor to explain the question. So just feel free to put any observation into the chat, and we'll come back to your questions then about in the middle of the webinar. Okay, Dimi,
Yep, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to first introduce quickly the types of issues that we'll present today. First type is alignment with external models. Go to the next slide, Max. So as you probably all, most of you know, within work package 4 of the single digital gateway, we're also working with application profiles that reuse to a much extent the core vocabularies. So from that work there, a few change requests came to the core vocabularies, which we're also now integrating and presenting today. Next to this, we're also looking to the public documents who use sometimes slightly different terminology, which is also what we're now including within the core vocabularies where possible. And also, as you know, mainly core location is based on Inspire. So we're also looking at changes that were made there, if you should take those along to the core vocabulary. Aside from that, we're also actively looking at inconsistencies between the different core vocabularies. So we want to maximally align between the different ones. This mainly relates to consistent use of data types and terminology. Then we have the improved usability issues, improvements, one could say. For example, to give more clarity on the usage of certain concepts by adding usage notes, adding a recommended code list, adding examples, and so forth within the specification. Now we have a number of open points. These are more the discussion points where we very much would like to get your inputs, for example, for adding or deprecating classes. And then, as I already mentioned, the change data types. Here and there, we change the data types mainly to align across the core vocabularies or to allow for multi-language usage. I'll start off with core location. We have, as you see, we have two icons. One is where we just would like to get a quick yes or no from you, whether you agree or disagree with the change that we are proposing. And then we have the more open-ended questions where we would just like to get a bit of a discussion going on from the working group on how to best tackle them. So for those who are familiar with the first version of core location, you might remember this flow of organizing the classes. So you had the RDF resource located, linked to the location, and from there on, geometry and address properties went to the respective classes. There was, however, a bit of misunderstanding or confusion happening because of this flow or this the structure of presenting the core vocabulary. Because in the previous version, the domains for geometry and addresses were open-ended. So there was not specifically mentioned that a geometry and an address property should be specified on a location. But as we were now not sending along the various distributions, this was perhaps not really clear to see, basically impossible to see. So we've actually made a revised version of the core vocabulary, which is this one, where it's now more clear that you can have a location, geometry, and an address for any type of RDFS resource. So these are all open-ended and free to use on whatever class you would like to use them. So you have three main classes. We have the location class, where you have two attributes: the geographic identifier, where you can, for example, use a URI from geonames to specify the location, or simply a name. So you will see the name is now a text data type to allow for multi-language and also even multi-script usage. So for example, you can have Paris in English, but also in another language, Paris in French. And also we also allow with text for multi-script. So you can, for example, have Athens, Athena in Greek, and also then in the Greek script as well. If you go to the core location specification, you will see some examples of how you can give along those multi-script and multi-language information. Then we have the geometry class. This is one of a bit of a more special class because there are a number of ways to express the geometry. As you will see, there are quite a lot of attributes in there, and basically a number of those are ways to express geometry. For example, you have the GML, the geography markup language. You also have the WKT, the well-known text representation of geometry. You can also simply do this via specifying the latitude and longitude as two separate fields, or via the coordinates, and then also giving along the coordinate reference system, which is a CRS. If you want to reuse this class, I would really propose that you go to the examples at the bottom of the specification. There it's very clearly explained how to use the different attributes in combination and the different options you have for specifying the geometry of a resource, both in RDF as well as in XML. And then finally, we also have the address class, where we have a number of properties that are mainly used to present a human readable version of the location of a certain resource. So where geometry is more technical, one could say, address is really a human readable version of it. So where you have the street and the city name and so on. This is also taken from Inspire as address representation. Don't think there are any questions coming in on the model itself. So then I propose to go to the first changes that we did. Coming from the work package 4 of the SDG, we slightly improved the locations definition. What first was a spatial region or name place, we now made it into an identifiable geographic place or name place. This better represents the content, I would say, of the class, where you can have either a URI, which is the first, or a text field expressing the place. The second definition that we improved was the address definition. As you could see, it was more a technical definition previously, where they mentioned an address spatial object for use in external application schemas. We've now made it a bit more, let's say, semantic, in the sense that we better express what it really contains. And so it now is a spatial object in a human readable way identifies a fixed location of a property.
Any comments on this? If not, then we'll move on.
Okay.
Sorry. Hi, Max.
Yeah. Who is this?
Peter here.
Peter Winstanley, yes. Okay.
Yeah. So well, one of the problems that I recall from a time back with locations is when you've got an address which is like you know, the third mooring on a pier somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. And you get these for businesses, you know, where fish farms and things like that, and you also get them for people kind of on houseboats and what have you. Yeah. And my question here is, can we deal with things that are kind of unusual and ad hoc? Because in addressing, sometimes those sort of things happen, and you can by having too tight a formalism, miss these out. And I know that XNAL, the OASIS standard, has got flexibilities that enable this sort of thing to be done, whereas other addressing standards like the BS7666 and so on don't let that happen. So I was just curious as to whether or not we could manage to have, I mean, I guess the locator designator does it, but I just wanted to double check that there was scope for doing that.
Yeah, I also think I think it's a good question, Peter. One of the things that we've always struggled with, also in the beginning of the development of DC of the location vocabulary, is we can't possibly cover everything in the structure. Someone made the comment, what about Japanese addresses? Well, we know that they're very complicated. One of the things that we have is a sort of a trapdoor here in the address, which is the full address, which is just a text string that you can put in anything that you want. If things that don't fit into the structure can be done there. Also, if there are locator designators for the houseboat opposite number so much in the street, that is also a possibility. And then also, if there is a URI for it, then of course that it goes into the geographic identifier that can be used. So yeah. there's I think there's enough flexibility in the modeling, and we base the modeling of address on Inspire, which already have gone through the whole problem of identifying the addresses for their purposes. So we haven't tried to do something more than other people have done, and we think that there is sufficient flexibility in the approach here that you can do anything you want.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to kind of raise the point, and maybe it would be helpful as we begin to put together, you know, primers and instructions to give out examples of some of these more unusual ones.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Thanks very much.
I'll keep the other questions also for later, if that's okay.
Okay. Did someone raise their hand as well, Max? I think it was Rob.
Raise the hand. I can't see that.
I think Rob Walker raised his hand.
Yep.
Can I go back to the definition of the new definition of an address, which I saw for the first time when you flashed it up there. There it is. I don't think an address is a spatial object. I think it's the representation of the spatial object.
Okay, so you suggest to go back to the previous.
Well, I can see the objection to the previous one. Yeah. But I think there's a confusion here, and it's also apparent elsewhere in the documents, between the actual real-world object and the representation thereof. Okay. And this is a not uncommon problem through all this, not only this work, but this sort of work. And I think that the address is actually the representation in terms of a human-readable or even machine-readable text string, it doesn't be text string, rather than the actual spatial object itself, which is the real world thing.
Okay, so a good point. So your suggestion is to change the new definition to representation of an address spatial object.
That would be an improvement from my perspective. I haven't had time to think about it because that was the first time that I saw it. Mm-hmm. My point is that, and this is one that comes up over and over again in this work, is that confusion between the two aspects. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Max, hi, yeah. This is Georgia from Italy. Hi. I would like to pose a question to all of you. Is an address a feature according to the geosparkle ontology? If it is a feature, then it is a spatial object. If it is not, okay, so we can discuss about the fact that that is a spatial object or not. It seems to me that an address could be a feature according to that definition. So if it is like that, then it is a special object.
Okay. So you have an opinion opposite to what Rob said.
I mean,
if you say if it's a geospatial object, then it's a feature, then it's a spatial object.
Yeah, definitely. According to that, geospatial ontology, which is based, by the way, on the ISO standard from OGC, then it is a special object, definitely, because a feature is a special object.
Right. I don't know if there is an answer to your question. Is it a feature or not? Rob? Is your hand still up, or did you took it down? Okay. Okay, Brecht says he thinks so. So let's see. Let's take those opinions. If people have other opinions, please put so in the chat, and then we'll try to move on. We'll note this point down. That's Rob made, and then we see if there is any more comments to that. And then I suggest that we move on to the next one.
Okay. Yeah, the definition of the locator designator was also slightly changed. It's actually more of a nuance, where it first was mentioned that it could uniquely identify the locator. It now mentions that it can allow a user or an application to interpret, parse, and format the locator within the relevant scope. I'm not entirely sure when it happened, but at some point this was a new definition also adopted by Inspire. So we mainly simply just retook it over from Inspire, as we also did in the previous version, to be in line.
Okay. So I see Alexandros suggesting that to define what a spatial object is. Is that somewhere in the specification, Dini? The definition of a spatial object?
Yeah, something that's currently in the specification.
So we may want to add that. Basically, there probably is a definition for that, for example, in Inspire. Let's see if we can add that. Okay. But I understand also from Bart in the previous discussion about the representation or not, that there is a discussion in Belgium whether the label, if the address is the label for the geolocation or the other way around. That's I think that is something that we also see here. So any more comments on that, please put them in the chat. Any comments on the locator designator? If not, we'll move on.
Yep, then we have the two administrative unit levels. I saw Sebastian already made a comment on those in the chat, more related to the data types. There was also a slide coming up on this. But here it is about the definition, which has also been slightly more elaborated in the new version, where the first one was quite short. We now elaborate a bit more into the uppermost level of name or named or units of administration related to the exercise of jurisdictional rights for the local, regional, and national governance. And then we also clarify that this also almost always represents a country, whereas for level 2, it's usually a county, state, or such area. I also think is now back in line with what Inspire is using as its definition for the administrative unit levels. So it didn't change semantics, it's mainly more elaboration on the meaning of it.
Okay, there's a question from Anna in the chat, but that's more on a higher level, whether or not the core vocabulary for location also should include the possibility to identify a virtual location, like, for example, the place where a webinar takes place, or the virtual place. I don't know if that's something that people would want to have, places not being.
I mean, in this vocabulary, we are speaking about physical location, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So I don't see the point.
Okay.
I mean, if it is physical, it means that is can be identified on a map. So I think that is our focus.
Okay. Any comments on the definitions of the admin unit?
Yes, I have more a question than a comment, because as my colleague said previously, this address is about physical addresses.
Yeah.
So I don't know how an administrative unit. So I can understand that the address has a country, a region, a municipality, or even lower, a parish, lower levels down the municipality. So I don't know if administrative unit, as it, so the concept of administrative unit is always, I mean, is fully related to an address more than a location. So, I mean, a location could be an administrative unit, but is an address always related to an administrative unit? Because what happens if we are talking about, I don't know, an address in a general concept? So, I mean, it's another question, which is the difference to talk about countries and regions than the administrative units? Because administrative unit for me has a different meaning than a region or a country. A region could be an administrative unit or not. Of course, a country is per se an administrative unit, but a region could be or could be not an administrative unit. Of course, it is a territorial unit, but not an administrative unit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but you're reading things into the label, I think. What you need to look at is,
yes, but the labels are also important. The labels are also important.
But the label is actually a shorthand for the definition. So is the definition wrong in that sense?
Yeah, but if you are talking about physical addresses, and then you mix that with jurisdictional rights, I don't know. For me, it's difficult to see the relationship between jurisdictional rights, competences, administrative competences, and addresses.
Okay.
So
you're actually,
I don't say that it is wrong, but I don't see the relationship between physical addresses and administrative competencies.
Okay. So you're actually saying that the addition of this part on jurisdictional rights to the definition, you don't really see that being useful.
At least conceptually, if we are representing the concept of a physical address, a physical address is just an address. I mean, it's nothing to do with the jurisdictions or not jurisdictions. So what I say is, of course, we need to represent jurisdictional locations.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think
it's useful and it's needed to have jurisdictional locations, but conceptually, it is correct to link directly when you are modeling the concept of a physical address to mention this particular thing, or is more appropriate to relate physical address with jurisdictional locator as separate concepts as itself, themselves. So that's my question.
I take your comment to say that the mixing of physical addresses with jurisdictional rights is not always the right thing to do. So in a way, you would say that the definition here mixes two things that should be separate. Do you understand it correctly? And
Yes.
not to say that in any application that uses the core vocabulary, you might use the administrative level for things that have to do with jurisdictional rights, but it shouldn't be a requirement.
Yes, it could be a requirement by a relationship with another concept. That is the jurisdictional location, but not by representing the concept itself of a physical address.
Okay, we'll note that.
Of course, they are related and should be related, but they are not the same concept.
Dimi, any comments from you? I see. Is Dimi still there?
Yeah. I was quickly looking up, and it's really just taken over from Inspire. So if you want to have another definition, you need to be sure. I need to take into account to not be aligned anymore with what Inspire is saying about administrative units.
But I also see Thomas saying that the core vocabulary should remain lean and should not mix different things. So I think we need to note that down, and I think there are two persons who already said that they think we shouldn't mix those.
And sorry, Max, also having in mind what Sebastian said, when you are modeling the jurisdictional location, you need to model that in a deeper way. So as Sebastian said, you don't only you have more than only country and regions. You have more jurisdictional, more administrative units. You have several levels of regions, provinces, municipalities, parish. It's a very complex concept by itself, an administrative unit.
I think that Inspire has 6 levels, if I'm not mistaken. So that was another possibility. On the initial version of the core vocabulary, we decided to leave it to 2, where you have level 1 always the country, and the level 2 as granular as you want. But that is, I think, what we would trying to avoid is to put too much details in the core vocabulary. But if people think that is a good thing to do, then I'm listening to the group and seeing if you think we need to add level 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is the Inspire hierarchy that Georgia knows.
Yeah, Max, Sebastian speaking here. So I raised a ticket for this 3 weeks ago, that we really need either you allow more levels than the 2, or you add a generic geopolitical coding, as we did in DKAPDE. So we can put several levels into it, like municipality and street code. And so even if you give us the 2, level 1, level 2, I think you will not allow a multitude of level 2s. And it sounds strange to put a level 5 into a level 2 field. So we really want to, we have this data. We have even codes for streets in Germany. We don't have uniqueness, again, not only for persons, but for addresses. So we really need more than the county, because we have several towns with the same name in the same county. So please give us a third thing.
What is exactly your proposal to add more levels?
Yes, to have a geopolitical coding URI, an additional field which holds then all the other levels.
Well, in the address, we don't have URIs in addresses. We have human readable things. So, but there could be a, as you say, a geographical code.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, if we have nuts, we can. At the moment, I do not see that we can use all the levels in unit level 2. We need either one generic field, call it as you want, but it is unit level X or something, where everybody can use his own local regional codes that we have, so we can identify.
Isn't that the locator designator that you can use?
No.
Okay.
This for us is the free text, the human readable free text. We really look to put in the statistical administrative units.
So it's a geocode field. Okay.
Yeah.
Because
And,
if, as I was saying, if you have a URI, URIs can go into the locator identifier. So if you have a URI, you can have that more clear.
but the thing, imagine you have an if you have a fixed address. So this is the ticket. This was raised 1 month ago. If you have an address, you can have 5 or 6 or 7 levels to point to this address. No, it's not. Yeah. If you give me a locator designator, I can put the street level. Okay, but I can't put the sub regions underneath of the county. Okay. So now, if we agree that this is e-government and that every member state has its own geopolitical coding in place and can map to the European NUTS, we still need a placeholder, however to put it. The county is not sufficient, as said here with North Rhine-Westphalia, 80 million people, towns having the same name, we can't identify them. So, and a requirement from federal states here that we, it's not enough to have a county.
Okay. So we
yes, that is precisely the point I made, and the reason why we should put the administrative unit as a separate concept with their own representation, as Sebastian said, with multiple levels that can represent each political organization of each country, and then it is easier to model that concept separately from the physical address, and then we can have a relationship between them.
So would people be in agreement if we added a field geopolitical code, and then every country can then decide what to put in there? That was the proposal, I think, that Sebastian had. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. We're looking at the clock. Any more comments? Just put that also, if you agree with the proposal, then put that in the chat if you want. And then we'll move to the next one.
Yep. So for those who are quite familiar with the diagram of the first version, you might remember there were 2 boxes, 2 classes of geometry. The geometry, basic one I could say, and then the alternative representation. But even there, it's a bit of a mix. As you will see, for example, in the first one, you see the well-known text representation, the WKT, but also the latitude and longitude are in there. So also that one is actually a mix of 2 different ways to represent the geometry. That's why we propose to put all different possibilities into one class to make it a bit more concise and more clear. There's one geometry class, and now with the different attributes that are possible in there. As you know, the core vocabulary doesn't impose any cardinalities, so you're free to use which ones you use. But again, I'd like to refer to the examples to have a look at the best practices that we are proposing from our side to use.
Comments there? I think this simplifies the model without losing the possibilities of providing that information. Okay. Open points.
Yes. Yes. So yes, you might remember from the last webinar, we added a relationship called registered address. I think it was within Core Person, and I think it already existed in Core Business, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And there was a question or a proposal, I think, to add this to the core location vocabulary. I think the proposition here is that we would propose to keep those properties within the respective core vocabularies, core person and core business, to not include it in the core location vocabulary. As it might make more, for example, it might make sense to have a register just for persons and public organizations, for example, also for businesses, but maybe not for other resources. So again, it's an open question, I think, to raise if you want to really include it within the core location vocabulary, or just leave it to the respective other core vocabularies.
Any comments there? We do not include registered address in the core vocabulary for location, but keep that in the core vocabularies that actually know about registration, which core vocabulary does, the location vocabulary doesn't. I see support for that proposition. Thomas and Bart.
So we are redefining the same property many times in the core person, in core business, and core public organization. All the 3 times we are redefining the same property?
No, it will be the same property, but it will be applied in the 3 core vocabularies because we have one namespace for the core vocabulary.
Okay, so it is in the namespace of core vocabularies in general, you see.
Yes.
You say, okay, yeah. That's fine, okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Dini, if I say something that's not correct.
I think from an RDF perspective, that means that the domain of that property will be person, business, whatever else we decide, but not RDFS resource.
Well, it could be RDFS resource.
It could be, yeah. I think that's.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it makes sense to have a very open domain in this specific case. I was just wondering which is the namespace of that property, because it seems to me more related to what we discuss in the core location. But if you say that we have like a general namespace for all the core vocabularies, that's absolutely fine.
Okay. Good. We'll move.
Yep. Yeah, I think the next point is the one we were just discussing, related to the administrative unit levels. I think perhaps we could focus now a bit more on the data type, as it was in the version that we presented. You saw indeed that it was, as Sebastian already mentioned, also a code for the first level, but then a text for the second level. I think the main reason for doing that was because there was not always a code available. There was always a code list that we could recommend. Not every country has a code list for the second level, which is why we used the text field. But following the GitHub issue discussion, there was a bit of pushback on this. I think most people agree that for all administrative unit levels, we should push for a recommended code list. So yeah, that's the first proposition. And indeed, you also see the second question from, do we need more levels of administrative units? That is already covered by adding the property we just discussed.
Yeah, the geopolitical code.
Yeah.
Dimitri, may I ask back? Do we now? We didn't see it in the structure. Do we now have code and text? Because as said, if you use the national codes, we still require the human readable version. I think we need both. We always need code and text here in these local, in these keys.
Yeah, true. I think that's also what we mean when we say code. Code is containing both a URI or an identifier as well as a human readable label for that concept.
I think we need every level in two different versions, as code and as text. The text then is in the national language, like München, with diacritical characters, as you allow with the text. And I need the possibility to encode both in every level. Whereas for the countries, we could agree that we do not need to write a human readable country name, but for a county and everything beyond, we need also the text variant.
But would that not blow up for many cases? I mean, in the sense that if we would duplicate everything in a new property, administrative level unit level 1 text,
but
codes,
also towns and parishes, you would have duplicated all the fields.
So that is maybe not, favorable either. Huh? The problem is that I think there's need for both to have access to both the label and the codification. There's necessary need. But then we come to the discussion that we started earlier on. What is the objective of the core vocabulary address notion? Is that to give somehow an labeled insights or of what the address is? Or is it a fully structured thing where you can do queries upon, give me the identifier that is located here and there, and then you rely on much codes? There are two different use cases. Huh?
I can say a phrase about our use case. So the core location is used in the SDG exercise in the once only principle architecture. We need the core location codings here to know which of the registers, which of the 5,000 registers that can give the birth certificate or the proof of residence. So in Germany we have 5,000. On municipality level we have these registers, and we don't have the identifier for these registers if we don't have a third or fourth level.
There is a proposal here also from Ana Rosa saying, well, why don't we have the code as a type identifier, which then allows you to say what the code is, what the register is, and it would also allow you then to pinpoint exactly what you want, rather than having to duplicate all the fields in an address for the possibility that you have codes. So you have one code field that you can actually identify what the code is and where it comes from. That would also meet that requirement to be able to address those 5,000 registers, because it would actually tell you in which register that code appeared. I see Ana Rosa proposal. Ana Rosa supports Georgia's proposal.
Yeah, Max, perhaps this is too much here for this meeting, but imagine you want to exchange evidences across Europe, and in Spain, I don't know which of the 5,000 registers is in charge, but I know the name Munich. So someone could, in a SDG query, put in core location, Munich, and then the German part encodes this in these local URIs. This is why I think we need both the British English name of the country, where some of the city, and the national encoding.
Yeah, I understand. I understand the use case. What we're talking here about the core vocabulary, trying to identify the needs on a general level. We need to try to make sure that your use case can be supported by an application profile that says you need to do this and that. If Ana Rosa's proposal to have one code field that you can repeat, where you can actually identify what the code is and where it comes from, then you have a possibility to do that, rather than, because I understand also what Bert says, duplicating all the fields to have codes and or text, that would not be very efficient. So let's try to see if we can find a more efficient way.
Yeah, so I say this is a good solution to have as many codes as possible and from type identifier, but still we have to live with language versions of you said text, and counties can be expressed in French in different languages.
But the text fields are always language strings. The text fields have a language indicator, so it can be repeated for different languages. Okay. That's already taken care of. Yeah. So to summarize, if we have an additional field that allows codes that have a type of identifier, then we can actually have that flexibly implemented. So propose that. We'll include that in the core vocabulary. Yeah. Okay.
And Max, related to this, when we say ID from type identification or identifier of type identification, why is the address ID a string and not also complex type? Do we really want a string to be the ID, the inspire ID of an address? Or shouldn't this be the complex type?
Dimi, did you?
Yes, address ID is indeed coming from also from the Inspire specification, where they say indeed if you have like a local registry of addresses with your URIs or another type of identifier, doesn't have to be a URI, can also be something non-dereferenceable, then you can put it indeed in that property to make the link from that class to your local system. And I think that's the reason why it is a string encoded within Inspire.
Okay, 9 years ago it was because vCard requires the string. But if we say we align with Inspire, I think it cannot be a string. It should be a URI or something, or a complex data type identifier, so that we can say that this is an Inspire ID.
Okay, so we'll have to look at that, Dimi, as to align with Inspire for this.
But cannot be then just a literal like identifier we ever have, where identifier is a literal. And if you really want to say this is an Inspire ID according to the Inspire schema, then it's of the type Inspire identification.
Yeah, sounds good. If this all fits in, can be casted and then validated in a schema, then this should do the trick.
Okay.
The last issue we still have is related to the geometry property. And this relates to the many different ways to express a geometry. As I mentioned, you can do it, for example, directly via URI. If you URI from geonames, you can use the geometry property to directly link to it. If you really want to introduce the geometry class with, for example, attributes latitude and longitude, you can do that as well. Or if you want to directly point to a GML or WKT, it's also possible. But in the previous version of the core vocabulary, only the range of class geometry was explicitly specified. While if you look at the examples, you could see that other ranges were also allowed, such as WKT literals or direct URIs from geonames, which is why we included all those ranges within specification and proposed to make the range union of those three.
So this property can be a data type property or an object property? This is what we are saying?
Yes, indeed. So, you disagree? Or
I don't like it very much, I would say. I really needed to understand in which way geometry can be like a string. In the geometry we put everything. Okay, we put a coordinates like a string. So I don't see the point to have it like a string in itself. If we point to the geometry, we have all the possibilities there, I think. So it means that the geometry will be always an object that can have some properties. We can use string with all the coordinates written as a string, or some more complex way to define it.
I follow the reasoning. I think the main reason to not do it is just ease of use. I think so you don't always have to create a geometry class if you just want to point to, for example, a geonames URI.
But geonames URI, are you sure that the geonames URI is a type of geometry? It's probably a type of, I don't know, location. I mean, we needed to check the geoname ontology to understand if the geoname URI is indeed the type of geometry.
And you can say that if you want to use a geoname URI, you use the URI in location rather than
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So you don't need this, in fact.
No.
And you say in the geometry class that we have here, there are all the options for literals, so that you know what the literal is about, rather than having just a plain literal with some numbers in it and not knowing what it actually is.
Exactly.
So
that's what
your
I'm
proposal
saying.
is that geometry property points always to a geometry class, and not to literals and URIs. I think that makes sense. Yeah, Jacob, you're right. Geoname is the geographic identifier, so that goes into location and not into geometry. I think that's a good point. I think there's support for that position, not mixing data type and object properties.
It's definitely a fair point. I think this was more a fix. If we looked at the examples that they gave, we should allow for this. But if it's indeed saying we don't agree with having both a data type and object property, we should revise the examples. So restricting the use a bit of what is allowed. Yeah, one could argue.
Okay, let's take that. There was another point that I took from Georgia a little bit earlier, which is sort of a more general one, that she says that there's probably a need to have an ID in everything. With the it has an ID to an identifier class, that it has its own properties, and that would be. I think that we came across that in other places as well, that it's probably wise to have an identifier everywhere that you can use whenever you want, if there is a particular identifier for the instance of such a class. And I think that would be something that we could do also more generally. Is that okay for you, Dini?
Yep.
Yeah. And then having IDs modeled the same way everywhere, I think it makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. We have taken all the points. Are there any other points that people think that need to be addressed in our discussion? People can raise hands. I don't see them, I think. Okay. If you see them, maybe just let me know.
Seeing any hands raised? No.
Yeah, Max, there had been other tickets to what about the other core location tickets not being addressed today? Like the inconsistency, like ticket number 11. For instance, in the XSD world, in serialization of the core location 1.0, we still see a lot of, we only have two different data types, text and code.
Yeah.
Where's data type? So
so
we expect improvements of the XSDs?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. That we haven't gone through that at this point, but yes, everything that we have discussed also today will give rise to new XSD, and we will take care of all the points that you made there. About that was also, I think, issue 11 was also about the representation, if I remember correctly. So we'll take care of those. So the things that we have presented today are the things that we thought needed some discussion or some agreement. There are other issues that we think are just things that we can handle through GitHub and through a new release, if that's okay with you.
And another question, in former times, this was called the W3C core location and ISA. So how much W3C is in here? Will this, how will you call this? You know, there's a web page, a namespace, W3C or core location. Will this be updated, or will this be a new version of core location without W3C?
There are actually two layers to this answer, to your question, Sebastian. One layer is there is the SEMIC ISA Core Vocabulary specification. That will be located and maintained in the SEMIC ISA space as is. And then we have an historic dependency on the URIs of the core of W3C, which have been owned over there. And I don't think it's wise that we are renaming those. That would be not a wise decision. So the biggest challenge is indeed how we deal with these historic URIs and how we keep and going to maintain on that. That's a challenge. Preferably, we stay within the core vocabulary namespace owned by SEMIC ISA. Does this clarify the situation, Sebastian?
Yeah. Well, I understand this will be a new version 2.0 something, and it will not. Yeah, you will have your own namespace. Understand, like the NHG.
Yeah,
namespace
exactly.
Hosted by your qualifications office. Well, let's see.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is with the older W3C. That dependency has to be explored and have to be some way improved. But yeah, there's no, at this moment, an intention to remove or to change those URIs.
Okay, good point. That's noted. And Gert, we'll follow up on that one.
Yeah, indeed.
And then the general thing that we provide examples, especially for those, for me, strange fields like thoroughfare, locator, designator. I just wanted to raise again that we really need concrete, real-life examples here to better understand what goes where. At the moment, I look on EIDA's SAML profile to understand what was supposed to be put in post name, and perhaps ISA can provide normative examples or non-normative examples here.
Okay, good point. Provide a provision of more and better examples of potential use of the core vocabulary. We'll take that into account. Okay, we'll move on then.
Yep. Okay. Then we come to the proposed changes for the Core Public Organisation vocabulary. First, a quick overview of the vocabularies. So the main class is the Public Organisation class, which is a subclass from the organization class from the W3C's organization ontology. And then we have quite a number of classes around that class that give more information about the public organization. You can have a home page, you can have a certain classification, a change event related to that public organization. You can have next and previous versions. Versions is not really the right word. Then, for example, the organization changes. You can use next and previous. You can have sub-organizations. You, of course, also have identifiers for the public organizations, contact points, addresses, and also administrative territorial units. There was an issue coming up on that. And a logo, which is an image object. Which is quite a number of information you can express about the public organization within the model. Okay. The first improvement was adding some attributes to the change event class. This one was taken over from the organization ontology from W3C, but there are no properties in there. So to give it a bit of content, we simply put in there the properties that W3C is proposing, as we don't really like to have placeholders or empty classes within the core vocabularies. So we just reused all the properties they are proposing within the core vocabulary. Yes, I think the order is...
I was expecting that, Sebastian. You always make that. The point is that we have tools that actually do things in alphabetic order, and because the E comes before the S, and the tool doesn't allow us to actually change them. So we hope you're happy that we'll leave it there.
Just as just so long, Max, as it's clear that what do we exactly mean by start at a time, end at a time, because it's contra-intuitive. An event is something that happens at a given time, and then we ask when has it begun, when has it started. It's difficult for me in my head to get what is meant here.
Well, it's meant that you can say that an event has started and an event has ended. And
but a change event is something that occurs. So what do we put in that field of start at a time, end at a time? Yes.
So you're asking for the definition. What is the definition?
A clear definition of what is start at a time, end at a time. I don't know it by heart, excuse me, and a description, but change events, for example given, legislation puts out a law that defines a new public organization. That's
so you need
started
to look
at a certain time. The law is voted, and it is an event. It has occurred on one day. And if you don't ask me what's the start date and the end date of that event, it's the same value that I should put in there. And what's the meaning of those fields at that time?
Dimi, any comment there?
Yeah, I'm looking into it, and they're reusing the properties from the prof ontology. That's where they're coming from. But I don't know if they have given indeed a best practice on what to do if you just have one date time. But it's definitely a good question. I'll try to look it up to see if they give some.
Not against the use of each other. I'm not against it, but it has to be clear what has to be put in those fields, just to be clear.
If I may add here, I think we needed to follow the usual way to manage event, okay? Because this is an event, okay? That is change event, and an event occurs occurs at, okay? And then there is a time interval. All the people here are saying the same. And I think that in the org ontology, they say that using prov for starting at time and ending at time, but they say precisely that the time period over which the event occurred should be expressed. So I would say that a change event has an object property that is occurred at time period or whatever you want with a time period, and then in the time period you have start time and then time, and probably is much easier to understand.
Okay.
I think.
Dimi, is that?
Yeah. I wasn't entirely sure if I got it correctly. So you mean you can either specify a period or a time, depending on the information you have, or?
I think what the problem was that now the start time and the end time talk about the time that the event started and ended. If the case is that the change event is instantaneous, which one do you use?
Okay.
Is it a period or is it a point in time?
Some usage notes or some explanation should come handy in here. That's my point. What should we put in those fields? And should there be two fields or not?
Okay. No, indeed, I'll have a look since we're using it from the organization ontology where they have some recommendations regarding that.
Okay.
Then we'll align or raise it again. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to ask, are there people around the table that have change events in mind that have a duration that lasts a period? Just a question. If this around the table, is there any evidence or people know?
not on my part in any case.
Okay, just okay, thanks.
Okay,
Okay.
we'll move to the change event subclass.
Yes. So there's currently one subclass of change event explicitly included within the core vocabulary, which is the foundation event. Yes, and I think the question here is that we would propose to deprecate this class to leave any kind of possible specializations for application profiles. I think the main argument for this is that why would we include just one specific one as a subclass and not include the others? Therefore, we just propose that we leave this up to an application a profile to specify specific subclasses.
Hello, yes, Thomas here again. I'm not. It's crucial in describing an organization, from my perspective, that we do capture certain types of events. Something buried and dead, or has something begun? Is there a foundation event that defines the organization? Is the organization legible to do something, for example? So it has to have a foundation event, for example. If not in a subclass, then at least in the core, I should expect something that's a type list or something on the change event class that you can, where you can have a denoter that says, beware, as an application, you should implement certain events in your application, in your system, in your interoperability scheme, and so on. So
I understand. There's always a little bit of a discussion whether you should have subclasses or just a type field. I was involved in the initial development of the core vocabulary, and there was very strong opinion that a foundation is not a change. Therefore, it needed to be a separate subclass. But I think if your proposal could be to add a type field to change events that should use a core controlled vocabulary for what kind of change it is, then we wouldn't need to create all kinds of subclasses, which would make things maybe easier in the modeling.
Yes, I was also involved in the development of the core CPOV. Yes, it's semantic. Is a foundation a change or not? It's as simple as that. There are strong opinions that matter. For me, it's a certain kind of change, and if a start is a change.
So would it be a possibility then that in alignment with this proposal to deprecate the subclass, to add a type field into change event so that you can actually use the controlled vocabulary to identify what kind of change it is?
Sorry, it's Peter here. I don't see why that would make it better. A foundation is still an event that should be possible to register. And yes, it's not a change as such, but it's to the organization since it didn't exist before. But it's a change in the world.
Yes.
So let's. I would vote for subclasses, foundation and others.
So we have opposite opinions here. Any other comments? Any other opinions here?
Max, I raised this point. I mean, from my point of view, it sounds strange to me to have just one event there without considering other change event that may occur, like fusion, merging, or bankrupt well, yeah, something that is closing. Okay. So the idea here is either we are very precise in describing all the type of events, and we can do, from my point of view, both subclasses or like a controlled vocabulary. And these two options, they have their pros and cons. Or we stick on a core vocabulary, we have just a change event, and then in application profile, we specify all the possible types of change event that may occur when a public organization is reconstructed in a certain way, okay? I think that we really needed to decide whether first of all, let me say, if in the core public organization vocabulary, we want explicitly all this type of events, and if so, we needed to be better precise here, or leave it to an application profile. Then we can decide to have subclasses or controlled vocabulary. At least these are the main choice to take. From my perspective, I mean, for me, it's fine both, okay? I don't have a really preference on that. But I definitely say that we needed to be more precise here if we specify a subclass.
Okay, so but I think what you're saying is not an either or. Something that is for a application profile, you can create subclasses, which that's not a problem.
Absolutely.
If we add the type field to change event, you can actually also do using a controlled vocabulary to do that.
Yeah,
so I think that would the addition would be make it more flexible, but then we leave the subclass into application profiles, and if not, and you're right in that, if we're want to have a subclass in the core vocabulary, then we need to be exactly precise of what those things mean. And currently we don't have that. So that was the idea, that we deprecate the foundation event subclass because we don't have a clear view of how that would be used. So that was the proposal. The intermediate proposal is, of course, to add the type and leave the foundation event in the core vocabulary, so that we deprecate it and people can use it if they want.
Just want to add, Max, the reason the event and foundation event is there, one of the reasons in any case, is that the definition of a public organization refers to the formal framework that creates an event that makes the organization public in the first place. So if you don't have an event that says you're public by nature, you don't have a public organization, and you don't have any place as an organization in this core. So that's why I want to press on the importance of something that denotes this event has occurred within this formal framework, saying this organization is public by nature. If you omit that part, then you take away the definition, the ground of this core. I would
that's already covered. The formal framework under which the public organization exists is already directly on the level of the public organization class.
Via the change event, as I see it. And the change event, change event is there, but the foundation is a type of change event that is very important, and that's why this is here. So either you put it on a subclass, either you put it on a type of controlled vocabulary where there are usage nodes, use this in any case, but don't omit those two in any case.
Okay. Good. Take into account. Okay.
I think this explanation from Thomas might be an addition that we could add to the usage note of public organization, because it's not in there. And that would then say, okay, you have to have a foundation event that relates to making the organization public.
Okay.
In the chat, I put that at least in Spain, a public organization is created by a regulation always. So I don't know if there is any possibility to link the regulation that set that creates the public organization somehow.
But it is currently, but it's from the change event.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let's move on. We take your comments into account. It's 11:25 almost, so we have still a number of things to do. So go ahead, Sabine.
Yeah. So it was just raised that the reference framework indeed where the change event class is pointing to. I'm actually proposing to change it to, actually asking if we want to change it to ELI legal resource, as it's also being used within CPSV AP. On the other hand, we also have CCV proposing a new class called reference framework, which is more broad than a formal framework. You see the definitions of both classes on the slide. This is a question, a proposal we're making with regards to the alignment of the different core vocabularies. This is an important question. Do we think we can always point to an ELI legal resource from a change event, or do we still want to stick with the formal framework class that we're currently reusing? As you see also in the diagram, we're using it from CPSV, but they no longer have it in their vocabulary. It's deprecated in their vocabulary.
I have to check the definition of ELI legal resource to answer that one. Yeah.
It's on the slide. It's the
oh yes, excuse me.
No worries.
Yeah.
I haven't noted. Come to think of it.
I think it should conform to that definition on that first side.
Okay.
Not sure if ELI legal resource existed at the time you created CPO. Not really sure about timelines.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably wasn't published yet. Okay, so if there is no objection to that, then we'll move to ELI legal resource.
I think it's logical to use that one instead of.
Okay, no objections, so we'll do that.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a. If you go to the next slide, Max, there's something wrong with this one. Yeah, we have the visual. So there is a class in the vocabulary called administrative territorial units. There was a question raised on what is the intended uses of this class? How does it also resonate with the other core vocabularies? And to be honest, the specification is not really entirely clear about how it should be used. As you can see, it also links the public organization to that class via the spatial property. I think what they mean with it is indeed about the area or the location where that public organization is, has certain rights.
If I may?
Yeah, please.
Here we have two kind of locations for the public administration. The address, so we are talking about the physical address, that can be more than one, of course, but also we need to talk about the jurisdiction of that public administration. There is a territorial scope for the competences of that public administration. So the territorial scope is not exactly the same thing that the territorial organization. For instance, I can put an example. NUTS, as you know, is you have NUTS 0, which is the country, and NUTS 1, NUTS 2, and NUTS 3. And then you can find a classification within the NUTS 1 level for Spain. Well, that is not either a territorial organization or a jurisdictional organization. NUTS 1 is only a statistical organization that is only exclusively used by the Commission, by the European Commission. So in this regard, as Sebastian said, it depends of the political organization of a country, and then the competence and how the competences are being distributed among the different public administrations that have been created in that country. So I don't see that we can say that the administrative territorial units are just a spatial property, because it is not. It is a jurisdictional property, and as I said, even NUTS doesn't match exactly in some cases, like the Spanish NUTS 1, to the real jurisdictional units.
Yes.
I don't know if I made clear.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't conflate NUTS with this administrative units. I think, as you say, NUTS is for statistical purposes and not for jurisdiction. So
and it's not a spatial property, as you put in the relationship between public organization and administrative territorial units. You put spatial. It's not a spatial relationship at all.
No, it's a jurisdiction
relationship.
So we should be clear about that.
Max, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
This administrative territorial unit geometry was already in the previous Core Public Organization Vocabulary, this property geometry between this class and the geometry?
Yeah, it was already the first version.
So I think that in the main Core Public, so in the previous version of the Core Public Organization, they meant something very spatial here.
It can be linked to a geometry, but it doesn't need to be linked to one.
I think that was also Ana Rosa said that there's no real spatial relationship there. There is a jurisdictional relationship, and therefore there needs to. It should not be done with a spatial property. It should be done with a jurisdiction property.
Yes, you have in a separate conceptual way. Any public organization has address, has a physical address or several physical address, but that is the real spatial property of the organization, and not this one.
Yes, correct.
So, and I also think that the link between the administrative territorial unit and the geometry is unnecessary, because it's not. It might be related to geometry, but I don't think that information would always be available.
Yes, that's correct.
So we do a jurisdiction relationship from the public organization to the jurisdiction, the administrative territorial unit, and then do not use the geometry.
This concept of jurisdiction was also in another vocabulary, the core person, correct?
Yes.
Vocabulary. And what we decided the last time for that? Because I think we can, I don't know. I don't remember precisely what we decided in that case of jurisdiction, because I remember that we discussed it.
Yeah. It should be aligned.
Yeah, okay, good.
And that's, it's not the location, it's the jurisdiction. The location is covered by the address.
Yeah, I think that we should make it clear, because this was kind of a mixture, probably in the intent. Then we have to make clear what is the intent of this relationship versus how you cater for spatial information about the organization.
Okay.
Yes, this one was already highlighted by Sebastian in the comments. So there's a bit of a mixture of use of the S or the British English S or the American English Z within the word organization and some of its derivatives. The reason why, and we wouldn't put the British English S everywhere is because we're reusing, as you know, from W3C's organization ontology. And I think it makes sense to reuse the concept as they do it there, to be as most aligned with them as possible, so we don't create any confusion when, for example, creating URIs and stuff like this. But indeed, I think that for the things we are creating, we will use the British English as everywhere where possible. I think that should be our rule of thumb. We can use British English everywhere unless we are really reusing something from W3C explicitly. And I have to say, we still need to do a proofread. I think there might indeed still be some concepts in there currently in the spec where it's not properly spelled according to this rule. So we still need to do a proofread, but I think that's the rule of thumb we would like to propose.
Okay. Any comments there?
I think it's not only W3C, but also schema.org. Wow, I think we must say, whenever we reuse, we need to use what is there, and it's often American. So schema.org also uses American English, I think.
Yeah. They're American. Yeah. So we'll make sure that we are consistent and correct.
So will this lead to a new logo of Core Organization?
No, because we are in our Core Public Organization, we use yes.
I think Sebastian means the blue logo. Huh? I think you mean. There it is with a net.
Yeah, it is with a net. Okay.
We'll do a proofread on everything. Okay. And then, yeah, it was already just mentioned, Sebastian, so schema.org. We are indeed currently depending on for two classes, being opening hour specification and contact point. Also during the previous webinar, there was quite a lot of voices saying that we would like to remove our dependency towards schema.org maximally, mainly because it serves other use cases. Our proposition, therefore, is that we create a similar class within the core vocabulary that then we can maintain ourselves within our namespace. That's the first proposition. And it is, yeah, okay, let's first take it to that one before we continue the second one. Does everyone agree with this?
So this removes all the dependencies on schema.org, while we still would link to the schema.org classes in the definition of the classes in the core vocabulary.
So Max, do I understand right? You will keep the attribute as they are called in schema.org, but move it to the own.
We create those in the core vocabulary namespace, and in the definition we will link to the schema.org ones as sort of what it is inspired on. So, but it will be in the core vocabulary namespace. The core vocabulary namespace URI.
Well, just a thought. One could consider renaming the attributes once you do once we do our own stuff. Perhaps it could be aligned more with the ISA way of doing, because I see has email, has phone number. Well, it could look a bit strange the way it is in the.
Okay, so you're referring to the labels that we use for them.
Yes.
Excuse me, I was saying that we should remove all schema.org elements.
Yeah.
In all core vocabularies.
I think it should be.
It's and replace them with specific EU classes. If a class or property exists that is useful, why should we use it? Why should we copy it that sounds silly.
One of the things it has to do with the management of external vocabularies. One of the comments that have been made is that, well, there is schema.org is not managed in the same way that standards are managed. Schema.org things sometimes disappear, are renamed, and this is something that we think it is. For example, if you have ISO or W3C things, there is a clear persistence policy of those things. Schema.org doesn't have that. Schema.org is more organic, let's say. So in that sense, we think that maybe reliance on schema.org is not good for the core vocabulary.
Yeah, if I may also give a very concrete example, the way we're currently using don't put me on this, but I think it's the availability restriction property. That's actually not how schema.org tells us you should do it, but we're not agreeing with how they tell us we should do it. And we actually raised a ticket for this, an issue on schema.org, asking it to be clarified. And it was raised, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and there was never anything happened to it. Just a good example of indeed this maintenance being put in the hands of some other organization, and then things start getting out of our control.
And the point that Jakob also is making is that it might be better to use the ones that schema.org actually took. So those things are from the good relations vocabulary. But then also, Jakob, the problem there is no formal maintenance of that vocabulary, and it is completely out of the control of what we're doing here. So we have always looked at what is the way to actually use existing vocabularies, and one thing that I think can make sense is to only use ones that are maintained by credible organizations. So you can ask what credible is. Google might be very credible in some aspects, but we find that there is quite a lot of opinion also in this group that we shouldn't rely on something like schema.org. Okay, so
yeah. Yeah, this was a bit of a general comment made just yesterday. Clearly saying that we should have really application neutral definitions within the core vocabularies. They're definitely not, that should be context neutral. There wasn't really a specific remark to a certain definition, but I think this is definitely something that we aim to do within the core vocabulary, and definitely our intention to have the definitions as application as neutral as possible. So since there was not really a specific definition that was being questioned, if there are such definitions that you think they are not context neutral, they're too application specific, please let us know. We'll do our best to make them more context neutral. But I'm not sure if the person who raised the issue is here today. There are really specific definitions you disagree with, please just let us know and do
yeah, I can say I had one comment there in one of the previous proposals where the core vocabulary definition mentioned member states, which was sort of making it very specific to be used within the European Union, whereas the core vocabulary could also be used by Serbia or by Russia, or so in that sense we deleted that mention of a member state, and I think we are looking at all the definitions to see whether we have made statements that are really application or regional specific, and try to avoid that as much as possible.
We are present here today, and maybe just to add to this, we will be able to maybe possibly provide some examples if need be, but it's not just a matter of it being context neutral or application neutral, but also the way the definitions are generally composed as we also mentioned in the last webinar. So maybe following some more traditional terminology and the standardization methods for writing the definitions, rather than making usage notes or notes that say, like, for instance, the definition of gender is the type of gender, not actually saying what it is, or something along those lines.
No circular definitions.
Exactly. Yes.
So I agree with that, and we are looking at that, and I think you also sent some pointers a while ago to an international standards that provides some guidelines, and we're trying to use those, but it's always a little bit of a struggle to do it in the right way. Okay, so but thank you. That we'll take care of that, and we'll look into that.
And please, if you spot a definition that the fields does not is not appropriate enough, please create an issue into GitHub so that we can correct it appropriately.
Jimmy, go ahead.
Yeah. Also, a general comment regarding the representation of the vocabularies. I think some really good suggestions were made in this issue related to the overall content of the specification, such as including the prefixes that are used. As you just saw for the organization ontology, we use the ORG prefix, so to include those somewhere within the specification. Providing labels in natural language is another one. I think that's something we already do. So we can definitely do a double check to see if that's a case everywhere. And then also, maybe I think the last point relates to more clear explanation of the data types that are used, such as the text data type that we're using that maps on the language string. So yeah, I think it's more of a styling comments mainly, are all valuable suggestions. I don't think anyone has an objection against these.
Yeah, Dimitri?
Yes.
Why not using Eurovoc, EuroEyes to point to concepts like first name, last name? It might be that for all of our labels, terminology exists in all member states translated in Eurovoc. One should, well, I don't know, but one could check. In addition to providing labels in natural language, why not encoding Eurovoc, EuroEyes?
Good point.
For instance, yeah, organization is a concept in Eurovoc. Per state also.
Good point. That's a fair point. We can definitely have a look to see how we can also include those in the specification. Thanks.
Okay. That what each one saw that is.
I think it's just saying.
Yeah, it was a duplicate. Okay. Any further comments? So we look towards Eurovoc and ERT, and we'll provide links to definitions. We can look at definitions to align them with what is already there, and we can otherwise point to definitions in other vocabularies. Yeah. Any more comments on this? If not, we've noted down the comments and the agreements, and then we have some more things we need.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's more of a formality. As I mentioned at the beginning, some data types were changed. It's mainly because we want to be consistent across the different core vocabularies. It's mainly those. You can see them on the next slide. I think for public organization, we added some text values here and there to allow for the multi-language and the multi-script, as we mentioned. And then for core location, I think it's more or less the same thing. Also text fields, and also the next slide you'll see the code that is being used then for the administrative unit level, but that's something we discussed minutes ago. On the next slide, I think that's yeah, okay. Voilà. So these were also changed.
Good. Message for
Max,
Sebastian.
before going ahead, so the decision is to keep in any case separate the business part and the core public organization part, correct? Even if
Yes.
they share same modeling elements.
I know there's an overlap between in the modeling.
Yeah, I was asking if it this is the final decision to keep separate those two, even if they share some common elements in the modeling.
For the time being, yes, the proposal is to keep them separate.
Okay, thanks.
And I was just going to the chat where
Max, yeah.
Yeah, where Sebastian has two general things,
Yes.
but only lists one.
Yeah, one very important, we really need a date for the XSDs. I understand that there will be now a finalization process and the publication of the model itself. What we are looking, is a date when we can use the XSDs being hosted at the right place. So at the moment we use the old 9 years old XSDs and anticipate the changes that will come. And for our national SDG implementation project, this would greatly help. If you say June, July, August, give us an indication this could help. And the second one, in the core public sector vocabulary, I think we had a mapping editor, a Drupal-based thing where member states could map their national vocabularies to the core vocabularies. Perhaps, could you please tell us something about whether the mapping editor still exists and whether we can now try to map the German person to the ISA person or location?
Just Sebastian, on your first question, let me jump in. So we will provide the XSD serializations in the 4th quarter of this year. Let's say we'll aim for September, October, but of course there's a lot of dependencies also with the, not directly with the SDG, but there are indirect links. And so at this stage, we can't give a precise date, but it will be after the summer, let's say September, October.
And the other question about the mapping editor?
We haven't thought about this. We cannot promise anything right now at the moment. Bear in mind that the CPSV is just one vocabulary, and we are talking about 4 vocabularies at this moment. First of all, you can easily understand that we would like to finalize any requirements that are there for the 4 vocabularies. New, as you saw during this conversation, we new things came up. So in that sense, there are still some other open issues that were mentioned during our first webinar for core person, for example. So that in that sense, this mapping editor is not something that we can is feasible at this very moment. The priority, of course, is in providing the XSDs, and then we will we will consider having this mapping editor, but it will be not realistic to promise you something at this very moment.
Okay, thank you.
Sebastian, is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, I thought to have understood also in the BREC DCAT AP exercise that this mapping editor is not specific to a vocabulary, but yeah, I will wait, and if you give us something, we could use it
We'll keep you informed.
And maybe, Sebastian, to add to this, Florian speaking, I see you refer to the CPSVAP mapping editor, which is not supported anymore for 1 or 2 years now. This was based on simply because there was no usage from the community. But as Pavlina mentioned, if there is a need, we can see what's and come with a more formal decision in the coming weeks to see if there's something we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Okay.
so I want to, just imagine all the member states will do the mapping exercise, and if we have a common language to express the mappings, we have the SCORs, but Drupal would provide a handy user interface, which could be same to all member states. Yeah, so thank you for considering a central guidance here for the mapping issue.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for sharing the need.
Okay. Florian, you want to take this slide?
Sure, or yeah, I thought also Pavlina, if you want
to. Pavlina, you want to
take it? It's the same.
Yes, I can take this. First of all, thank you for all your contribution on and the very valuable feedback that you provide us during this conversation. First of all, please provide us with new issues in GitHub. With all the things that were mentioned today. As you may understand, we needed to close with the consensus all GitHub issues that are still open and needed to be closed, or perhaps some news. We needed to prepare a new specification for a core person, business, location, and organization, together with the visualization of all core vocabularies combined. If you recall, there was a picture that combined all vocabularies. It is our intention to provide a new version of this picture combining all vocabularies along with the CPSVAP and the CCCEV, so that we can all have the big picture. So as I said, I mentioned before, all issues, outstanding issues that were not covered during this webinar or closed for which holds also for the first webinars, as well as this one, meaning for all vocabularies, will be followed up with the editorial team. We encourage you to provide additional input if needed, and we will. Is our intention to come up to have 1 or 2 webinars during September in order to tackle all those open issues and have a consent of the final version. In order to provide it, then we will be able to provide the final XSDs as said already mentioned. We totally understand the concern of member state with regards to the single digital gateway regulation, but at this very moment, since still we have a number of open issues, I think it is understood that we cannot provide with a stable XSD. So that's it from my side. I would like to thank all of you for having and here in the webinar. And
okay, thanks everybody. And we'll be back with more news. And please look at GitHub, provide comments, provide issues, and help us to get the specifications completed. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.